Welcome to White Glove Geography today, and we're going to be looking at Brazil, the economic case study of the country here. On this next slide we can see the usual tab geography information that we have on the information about Brazil. And on this slide here we've got the same information but presented in a pictorial way. We're going to go through this in a little bit more detail. Brazil is the largest country in South America. It's got a population of about 208 million people. It's also a free trade area. It encompasses a range of countries called Mercosur. The Mercosur area, those countries such as Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, they can trade quite freely with each other. The core members are in dark blue and the partial members are in light blue. We've got the associate members, they're on the west of South America, and they often find it a little bit more difficult to trade with the countries on the east due to the Andes Mountains, and the Andes Mountains run roughly in this kind of area here. Brazil is really important for many of the landlocked countries in South America. So for example, Bolivia and Paraguay, they struggle to export their goods because they don't have any access to ports or the sea because it's totally surrounded by the land. They rely on exporting goods through many of the ports in Brazil, for example Rio de Janeiro, or of course they've got the option to fly their goods out. But of course that's quite expensive, something they want to avoid. Many of the measures in the world put Brazil at about the 8th largest economy, so huge amounts of imports, huge amounts of exports in the world. The environment in Brazil, particularly the Amazon rainforest, is really important. It absorbs about 100 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year, and that's mainly in the Amazon rainforest. In terms of global importance, Brazil exports large amounts of meat to other countries, and it makes about $6.9 billion a year from cattle ranching. Of course, that activity means that rainforests need to be cleared, and also many of the iron ore mines, for example the Vale mining company, they export huge amounts of iron ore to different countries. In terms of Brazil, the social and economic context, about 12%, just less, are unemployed. However, the interesting thing over the last few years is the fact that the middle group here, that has increased massively between 2003 and more recently. So that's quite large now, the middle income group. The high incomes have also increased. However, it's significant that the low incomes have decreased. Those are the people that will be living in favelas, such as Racina favela, but you can see there's still huge numbers of people there. In terms of Brazil, there's a social and there's a racial issue in Brazil. Of the killings, of the murders in Brazil, 70% of the killings are of black people. And there's about 1.5 times more black people in prison than other ethnic groups in Brazil. So you can see there's some racial divides in Brazil. The influence in Brazil, in terms of the context, is mainly Portuguese context. So the dance, the culture, the language, and also the religion of Brazil. The main religion is Catholicism. The environment of Brazil, we've talked about that a lot in other topics. So for example, the tropical rainforest topic. So we're not going to go into that in huge amounts of detail here. The employment structure, we have primary industry, and the primary industry is to do with raw materials, so the export and the production of meat, wood, iron ore, all those kind of things from the ground. Brazil is actually more interested in increasing its secondary manufacturing base. That's because many of these goods are sold at a much higher price. So if Brazil can take the iron ore, make steel out of it, and then make cars out of it, those can be exported at a much higher price, and that gives a much more rapid economic development. There's a large number of tertiary jobs in Brazil, so there's going to be many people working in cleaning, in the hotel sector, in tourism, maybe there's going to be teachers, solicitors, doctors, all these kind of service jobs. Tertiary jobs are service jobs. But the key thing is today is it's a secondary sector that Brazil wants to improve. The example that we're going to look at is Jaguar Land Rover. This is a company that started in the UK, and they've decided to invest about £240 million into a factory in Brazil. That was in the last few years. That's created about 300 skilled jobs, and of course there's going to be many more jobs in the supply chain to produce these cars. There are many positive impacts of transnational corporations or transnational companies, so Jaguar Land Rover being one of them. Jaguar Land Rover, as we've said, has brought a lot of investment, £240 million. It's brought the technological advances that have been seen in the UK in terms of the automation in the supply chain, and also huge amounts of expertise and knowledge of how to produce cars. There are, of course, negative impacts of transnational corporations or transnational companies. One of these is that unfortunately many of the profits go abroad. And also, when looking at the company as a whole, many of the decision-making exercises will be taking place in a different country. So, for example, the decisions about the Jaguar Land Rover factory in Brazil, near to Rio de Janeiro, will probably take place in the UK, and many of the Brazilian people won't have a lot of say about what happens to them. When a transnational company or transnational corporation invests in a country, it has what's called a positive multiplier effect. It creates jobs and skills. So we've seen 300 jobs have been created directly by the factory and many more in the supply chain. Those people who work in these places, they pay more tax, and therefore the tax can be used by the government to improve infrastructure, and that then makes the place more attractive to other investment opportunities. Brazil has deep political relationships with other countries, so we're going to look at China as an example. Brazil and China have agreed a joint trading pot of about $20 billion, and that supports the imports and exports between those two countries. For example, the Vale Mining Company, they export about 50% of their iron ore to China, because China itself is going through a huge growth boom, lots of building taking place. So it's about 180 million tonnes of iron ore. Vale Mining, in the production of iron ore, what happens is huge amounts of liquid waste material that's toxic gets produced, and this often gets stored in slurry ponds, and these ponds are held back by dams. And there's a concern in Brazil that many of these dams are unstable. So for example, in 2015 one of the dams burst and all the fish in the neighbouring river, the Dolce River, were killed. About 62 million metres cubed of toxic waste was released. It also affected drinking water in nearby cities. This was the huge environmental disaster in Brazil in 2015. The improvement in quality of life due to investment and industrial development can be seen through these figures here. The life expectancy in Brazil has increased from about 65 to about 75. That's to do with the access to healthcare, it's to do with the healthy living, and also the HDI number has also increased. We've seen before that if the figure is towards 1, then that is a very well developed country. If the figure is towards 0, that is quite a poor country. Brazil has increased from 0.61 to 0.76 in its HDI indicator. HDI incorporates health, education and also income measured by GNI. We're going to look at aid as well. So even though it's the 8th largest economy in the world, we're going to look at aid in terms of Brazil and just general aid. There's short-term aid, and that's to do with disasters, it's to do with the emergencies, those immediate things that countries need so that people survive these natural disasters. So that's to do with food, water and shelter. The aid that we don't often hear about is long-term aid, and that's often from government to government, that kind of higher level of giving. And that's to do with infrastructure, so transport, health, education, maybe power supplies. That's long-term aid. In terms of the examples that we're going to look at in this course, we've seen that about $1 million has been given by the Charles Mott Foundation to the Pulaga village in the Amazon rainforest. That's for solar panels, and that's mainly gone towards buying the solar panels and also training up the locals so that they're familiar with how to use them, and therefore it's a sustainable use of the panels. Also, the UK government gave about £80 million to Brazil Particular focus is for the favela regions, the long-term development in terms of the education and also the health. We have here some more information, the pictures that we've just looked at, so pause the video here if you want and have a look at these images.